Religious Studies 221, Good News of the Gospel of Mark, part 3 of 3. So, I love all of the Gospels so much. And at any given time, I could tell you this one's my favorite, that one's my favorite. I love Mark, so I'm sad to see us bring Mark to a close today. But just a note as we continue in this course. What are we doing when we have 3 sessions on each Gospel? Next time we begin 1 of 3 on Matthew, and so on with Luke and John. What we're doing in these lectures is looking at what is distinctive about each of these 4. So here's what's important to note. We're not going through the whole story. We actually follow our author by going through the whole story only at the very end, recapitulating all of these, sort of doing what he calls the horizontal reading and reading straight through, putting it all together, starting with the birth, moving through Jesus' ministry, and then, of course, to Jesus' death and resurrection. That's how we'll conclude the course. So I say that because you might wonder, this is our 3rd of 3 on Mark, and there's plenty of chapters of Mark and lots of the story that we haven't told yet. And that's because that comes later. What we want to do right now is to this is sort of the heart of the course. What is Mark's portrait? Why was Mark moved to write? How is he presenting Jesus in a way that he hoped would be inspiring? What we do know is that Mark is almost certainly writing to persecuted followers of the way. And I use that term rather than Christians because we don't really quite have that term yet. It will come fairly soon. But we could go ahead and say the earliest Christian church now. Gentile, meaning non-Jewish, and this is in Rome. And we do know that persecution is horrifyingly one of the hallmarks of the time. It's one of the few times in the 1st century where we do know that people are being tortured, even murdered, for practicing this new way. And so Mark has a particular set of inspirations for writing, and one of them is to bring hope to people who are suffering by showing them a suffering hero. Another, of course, as you know now, is to try to reach out to those who are developing theories about Jesus that he thinks are antithetical to what Jesus came to offer. If Jesus isn't fully human, this project means nothing, because Jesus is here as an example and as a model and as a way of exemplifying the fullness of humanity. And if he isn't human, that doesn't work. That doesn't make sense. There's no humanity to show if he's simply a divine being masquerading. And that theory was out there, and Mark wants to combat it. So there are several reasons that he writes. And we've spent a little bit of time now exploring those. What we want to do today to bring it to a close is to look at a couple of them as they are manifest at the end of the story. So there's always in ancient biography much concentrated at the beginning and, as we've noted, much concentrated at the end. Mark spends just about half of his gospel in the Passion, the triumphal entry in Jerusalem to the end of the story where, and we're going to look at this today, in Mark there is no post-resurrection appearance. We don't meet Jesus again after he has died. So Mark again devalued by an earlier generation precisely for that reason, and now we look at that ending and we see what Mark was up to, and we find it quite inspiring. So let's take a look at that. We'll probably close with that today, but for now I want to jump into a couple of videos from the very end of Mark, because they again will break open a lot of the themes that are common to Mark, and even some of the literary devices. Since this is our concluding lecture, we want to take a quick look at a couple of those. You'll get some of that in your book as well. I'm sparing you in these lectures a lot of the dry details. You will get that in your book, and your author presents it very well. Questions like, who was the author? Your author will walk you through that. There are some theories. And he's going to go ahead and he's not going to tell you that there's any one that's absolutely been demonstrated to be true, because we know that these are only theories, but he's going to say the prevailing one, why not? So I'll leave that to him and a couple of those details. But for now, what we want to do is jump to the end of the story. And I'm going to take you now to chapter 14 and 15. This is only a 16-chapter book, so you can tell this is the real moment of the ultimate intensification of the story. All that Mark has been building up, all of that conflict, and again, all of those questions about identity, that, as I've suggested, is the centerpiece of this gospel. They're all going to come to this conflict, this point of ultimate conflict at the very end of the story. There's been conflict all along the way, but nothing quite like what we're going to see here. Let's jump in and see this video, and then we'll make some comments.
They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law came together. Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Then some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, "I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days will build another, not made with hands." Yet even then, their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus. "And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his clothes. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, "Prophesy!" And the guards took him and beat him. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. "You also were with that Nazarene, Jesus," she said. But he denied it. "I don't know or understand what you're talking about," he said, and went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, "This fellow is one of them." Again he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." He began to call down curses, and he swore to them, "I don't know this man you're talking about." Immediately, the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times." And he broke down and wept. Very early in the morning, the chief priests, with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin, made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "You have said so," Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of?" But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Now it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. "Do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" asked Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. "What shall I do then with the one you call the King of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. "Crucify him!" they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him!" Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified.
Watching this, of course, it just raises so many questions for us. You know, their case seems very weak. Their evidence disagrees from one person to the next. Why does Pilate do something when he seems to know it's not the right thing to do? He's in charge, after all. He has the power to make this choice, and he can do what he wants. It's Rome's choice, not the chief priests. Why has the anger and the hatred and the conflict gotten to this level? These are all incredible questions. Why is Jesus rather silent here? Curiously, why isn't he mounting a better defense for himself? And when we get to the last segment of this course, we'll spend more time on some of these questions about Jesus' death, the arrest, the crucifixion, the trial. We're going to actually go through the story bit by bit to be able to really ask those questions in depth. What we want to do today, instead, is to focus on some of the features we see in this very intense scene. This is Mark's work, and we want to see how this reflects Mark's project in these incredibly vivid ways. So what did we hear? Again, we heard identity, questions about identity. Absolutely, that was the centerpiece of what we were hearing, right? We heard Son of Man, Son of God, Messiah. Are you the Messiah? He's silent, and then finally he says, yes, but how does he answer? He says, the Son of Man coming in on a cloud. And of course, you know, there's a dispute here, and you can see it. And it goes back, as we've suggested now in so many of the lectures, to the ways in which the religious leaders are looking at someone that they see as a threat to the survival of their community. Because holiness means so much in Jewish thought and in Jewish customs. And one doesn't, you know, in the practices of Judaism, one shows this deference and this reverence and this sense of otherness. And here's somebody who seems to be crossing those lines, and once again they're asking these questions. Their case is pretty weak, but once again they're asking these questions, and they're getting precisely the answers that will provoke again this feeling of fragility, of threat, this sense that they need to eliminate this person who they think now puts them at risk, in essence. How they could persuade Pilate, again, we want to come back to those questions because they're quite poignant questions, and we will do that in just a few weeks. But again, for today, identity. We want to, again, focus on this and see how important in Jesus' own articulation the identity Son of Man becomes for him. And remember, this is again ironic, as is so much of Mark. Son of God is a more human designation than Son of Man, which carries these images from later Old Testament writings of the Son of Man riding in on this cloud as part of God's judgment and restoration all in all. Whereas sons of God were even applied, that term is even applied to some of the emperors. You know, God's children, we'll even say today, and we mean human beings. So Son of God is often the term we think of as the one that's showing Jesus as a divine being. But these terms are interchangeable and they're nuanced. and they get used differently. Son of Man is the claim that you saw in this video really threatened his interlocutors. And this is the claim that from their scripture had all of this resonance. This was one of the possibilities for this messianic being, for this reclamation of all of the glory of the people of Israel in this relationship with God, finally, feeling once again that maybe all had been restored. And in this person who ironically has come precisely to offer that restoration, they see nothing but the threat to that restoration. So all the way through Mark is etched in this chiaroscuro. It's dark and it's light. There aren't many other colors in Mark. And you're always going to see these stark juxtapositions right next to each other. This in very, very clear and vivid shadows and terms. So this again is Mark's literary skill. So today we want to use these final chapters to see the composition that Mark is and to appreciate for some of its qualities that are unique to Mark. And irony is certainly one of that, and triads is one of them as well. And you saw that extraordinary moment where Peter denies Jesus 3 times. This is a classic Markan technique. Mark loves triads, and we still use triads. When you want to really emphasize a point, you make it 3 times. And a lot of preachers do that. And I have 3 points to make, or I'm going to illustrate this with 3 different illustrations. 3. I'm not sure why. I don't know anyone really knows why. 3 seems to be the number that allows you to really reinforce and gain a certain power. But Mark definitely likes to use triads, just as much as intercalation. We focused on that. A couple of you in your papers, by the way, made the mistake of identifying literary criticism with nothing else but intercalation, as if those are the same phenomenon. No, literary criticism involves a whole host of different ways in which we see what Mark was up to. The tempo of his writing is very fast. Could you feel that in this scene? Things are moving quickly. There isn't much time for too much talk or for reflection or for the inner mind of any of the characters. No, Mark wants to take you right there. That's a literary choice. I'm going to get you there fast. So this tempo, the triads, and as we saw, he does occasionally use intercalation, but just this note, just because a few of you did make that error in your exercises, intercalation is just one literary technique that we see in Mark. Now, triads, he seems to use more than any other theme. He uses them to show us the failings of the disciples. The disciples often fail in triplicate, and it's another way for Mark to intensify that theme, which we certainly see here, and it's quite poignant. For Peter, on whom the church will be built, is the worst failure here. So again, that's an ironic juxtaposition. And Peter has been, in some sense, the disciple we've heard from the most, and yet he vanishes at the end. And it's the disciples we've heard from the least, the women disciples, who rise up and become the heroes at the end of the story. This is another of the ironies at the end, and the final video I'll show you today is of the women at the end who have endured and become the first of apostles. And Mark will show us that. But just a couple more comments about what we just saw. And what you're looking for in literary techniques is, in addition, one final that I'll mention, Mark's love of foreshadowing, where he points out that something has been foreshadowed before, and we saw that very much in this video in the Peter sequence. Mark likes to remind us that we've had hints of things. Hey, we had hints of things in the first line of the whole gospel. This is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. That's foreshadowing in the least subtle way and in the most vivid kind of way. Mark loves this. He's going to plant a seed for us that will then sprout later in the work, and that is a way to reinforce. Mark wants to continue to reinforce his points to make them very powerful. He's got our attention. He wants to kind of grab us. The other Gospelers don't need to grab us quite so much. Mark wants to grab us. We're living in that kind of time. The stakes are that high. He feels like he needs to save this project. And he's going to do it by giving us that fast tempo. And literally, he's going to move us to the place where he feels he can grab us and hold us and make us see what's going on here. That this is the divine being who's come as a ransom for many, who's giving himself in self-sacrifice, and who is silent in the face of these attacks, which is quite an extraordinary choice. Is that a touch of classic Roman Stoicism here? It certainly is a way that we now see that Jesus is making the choice to do this. He's not trying to defend himself. He's not trying to get out of this. He's come precisely to do this. This is his identity. This is his mission. And Mark has wanted us to see that from the beginning of the book. And now it's the end of the book, and it's happening. This is who Jesus is. This is the work that Jesus has come to accomplish. This gospel is a gospel of acts and of Jesus' project being shown to us in these stark and vivid scenes that Mark puts together so skillfully for us. What do we see at the end here? We see spitting, so we see honor and shame in its most vivid manifestation. So a lot of these themes we've been exploring now, you saw them at the beginning, you're going to see them at the end. Absolutely. You hear the term immediately 3 or 4 times in that video. Again, you're not going to hear that from anyone else but Mark. So many of those primary themes here reflected as we near the end of the story. One more before we end it with the women, and I want to show you this one. We're actually going to take one step back in the story to see a couple of extraordinary scenes.
But about that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard. Be alert. You do not know when that time will come. It's like a man going away. He leaves his house and puts his servants in charge, each with their assigned task, and tells the one at the door to keep watch. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know when the owner of the house will come back, whether in the evening or at midnight, or when the rooster crows or at dawn. If he comes suddenly, do not let him find you sleeping. What I say to you, I say to everyone, watch. Now the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread were only 2 days away, and the chief priests and the teachers of the law were scheming to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him. But not during the festival, they said, or the people may riot. While he was in Bethany, reclining at the table in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, "Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor." And they rebuked her harshly. "Leave her alone," said Jesus. "Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them any time you want, but you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory.
An amazing moment, and this is the one person who understands Jesus' identity. And so this moment in the gospel is placed to make sure that we see her for exactly who she is. Jesus has no other humans around him who he's able to point to as models of what we as humans might be able to see. Notice that the disciples tend to be failures for the most part in the Gospel of Mark, disappointments, but not her. She comes in and she prepares his body for burial because she understands. She alone seems to understand. So again, this wonderful Markan irony, that's the outsider, the uninvited guest, the one who's being rebuked by the disciples, who actually has the answer, and who Jesus draws in as the only one he sees as actually possessing the truth and this kind of enlightenment, and who has followed him faithfully, and who does this act that shows that she understands that he needs to die, and that he needs to do exactly what he's set out to accomplish. We saw earlier in the gospel, as we pointed out in an earlier lecture, that it was actually the demons, or the possessed beings, the ones that had to be drawn out, that he had to silence because they knew too much early on. For the first time, we're seeing somebody who understands him, and he's choosing not to silence her because she's seeing him for the fullness of his identity. So again, this wonderful way that we see identity being affirmed. Now, the first part of the video, and then we're going to just move to our final video of the day and a few more comments. The first part of the video, it ended with that rather ominous line from Jesus, "Watch, I say to you, watch." We're going to see this even more in Matthew, but it's an important point, and I don't want to have gone all the way through Mark and not mentioned it. And that is that Mark has an apocalyptic tone that we want to note. That entire first half of this video was a teaching about the possibility that God's reign would be constituted now, fully. In other words, let's make that very simple, that the world as we knew it would end, possibly even in the disciples' lifetime. And Jesus is saying, stay awake, watch, because this is coming at any moment. God shattering through the darkness and bringing the world to this place of recreation and restoration. Watch, he says. And so, what we know about the composition of the Gospels is that people in another generation started to say, well, we thought he meant the world was going to end within the disciples' lifetime, and now the disciples have almost all entered into their glory, and we're still here. So what did he mean? And one of the great questions is the ultimate meaning of apocalyptic, because actually here we're still here as well. And yet, does it feel sometimes like the world is a bit apocalyptic? Apocalyptic language involves the clashing of nations and a certain spirit of darkness and plagues and pestilence and conflict and bitter struggle. And you could use almost all of those terms and not be called over dramatic, even applying them to 2020. So Jesus' point appears to be that God is ready to break in at any moment. And that's something that has to do with our own understanding of the kingdom reality as both a future event, but also something that in some ways has begun. A realm that is available for us to inhabit or occupy even now. That somehow, you could be a citizen of that kingdom even now. That God is ready to break in, and so stand guard and be ready and watch, because that call will come. And this is where people started to understand Jesus' apocalyptic language. A very big part of Mark, though, and we want to make sure that we've noted it because it'll be a big part of Matthew as well. Even more so, we'll talk about apocalyptic a bit more. Starting next class when we enter Matthew, but we want to close it out today and close out our study of Mark with this unbelievable ending. It's very brief, and then I'll make a few concluding remarks. This is how Mark brings his whole incredible story to an end.
When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid.
They said nothing to anybody because they were afraid. And this sounds like Mark, doesn't it? Echoes back, this is another literary device, to some of those questions about silence and secrecy all the way through this gospel. But more than anything else, this is the ultimate irony at the end of this gospel, so filled with ironies, and carrying a story that's filled with irony, that the divine being would yield power and suffer and would be brought low, only to then again be made high. So these reversals and these juxtapositions and these ironies. But here, the ultimate one in many ways, from the Cinderella gospel, undervalued for centuries, in part because of this ending. How could Mark end it that way? There's other material out there. Why does he end it with the women running? And for many centuries, it was seen as maybe just a mistake, or something that showed the failure of Mark to really inhabit the fullness of the story. And so people turned again instead to Matthew, Luke, and John, where they saw a more satisfying sense of the conclusion and all of the inspirational content with which they end their gospels. But here, instead of ending with inspiration, what does Mark actually choose to do? This is the ultimate irony. So to close it out for Mark, the story begins with an answer, and it ends with a question. And that's the opposite of what we would ever expect. He started his gospel by saying, he gave us the ending. This is Jesus, Messiah, Son of God. And then he ends with this question, which is really in some ways a question to his audience. And that's Mark's project. He's trying to grab his audience by the neck, by the collar, and shake them a little bit and say, what are you going to do? This is a time where you're being called, whether that's to push back on these false notions of who Jesus is, whether that's to accept your fate with dignity and to have this model of suffering and yet flourishing through his suffering. But there's this question that's being asked of you, and how will you respond? And Mark's ending of the story actually, literarily, fits exactly perfectly with everything else he's done, and this is part of the reason. We end with the point with which we started, that Mark has been known as the Cinderella Gospel, the one that seemed a little bit rough, unfinished, but actually people now say is probably the most polished and finished of them all. We'll talk about all of this more in section. It raises lots of questions, as I said. We'll talk about some of the bigger questions about the story later on in the semester. We watch these videos about about Jesus' death, and we wonder, what does this mean? And we will take some time for that at the end of the course, but we jump into Matthew because right now what we're doing is looking at these Gospels and asking, what's distinctive? What's the portrait that's being offered? And we continue